Maybe we will go to Lynda. I hope I'm not catching you off guard here, because I think it would be good for you to summarize what you heard, how you view what you've heard here, and to pinpoint some of the issues that you think the panel should now engage in conversation.
Yes, you are catching me off guard. Hello. I think one of the things traditionally that women have done and has served creativity, has served men, is to be the space holders, to be the weavers, and weave together the threads of what has been spoken. So that's not to say that the role that I'm playing here, I think it's a very important role. You know, and invite us all to consider that. I also do think it's a challenging role, but I was struck with a number of things. I think Jeffrey had a very good, in my mind, way of explaining how he does what I would call some kind of integration of spirituality and psychotherapy without in any way consciously bringing in the word spirituality, but he brings it in with listening. He brings it in with his being, his incredible spaciousness. And I think he integrates more traditional psychotherapy, because I think he's right on when he talks about the case, that he is going to replay the transference that this woman had with her father. It kind of needs to be replayed to be, for her to find a new way, and for him to be as non-present as he is. So I think he articulates his version of an integration and shows one way to integrate, which is very different than, let's say, Sam's way, which is much more explicit, and perhaps even Loch's way. It seems to me that when Loch is addressing the case, Loch is suggesting that we learn very consciously to be mindfully aware of the non-manifest. I'm not sure how Loch suggests we do that with a client, but it sounds more like it's from our being, from our not knowing, from our not rushing into our heads, from our presence, from our truly meeting the client. I'm still not exactly sure how many people in this room would know what to do from a non-dual point of view, which is not to say anything except that might be one thing you might want to articulate more, what that really means. I think some of the issues that come up, and one thing I wanted to start with is the opportunity for all of us here, from so many points of view, is to, in this room, can we be mindful now of what is in our minds? Can we be open and aware and not go into judgment, not go into make wrong of anybody's point of view? Can we stay open and embrace everything? And then see what lingers in us. I think that's the biggest challenge, because this is a big task we have here, how to integrate. And so how do we do that? Are we working with ourselves right now to stay open, or are we noticing that we're being closed? It's not bad to close, but are we staying aware? And are we doing that in our non-manifest level, in our minds, in our hearts, in our bodies? So I think that I really invite us all to take that challenge on. The other thing I'd like to say is somewhere when Sam starts to talk about really introducing spirituality consciously, I think it raises the question that the panel might talk about, which is technique versus process. I think Jeffrey was very clear that we're dealing with a delicate unfolding process. But I think when we start to raise things, we become educators and teachers, as opposed to stay with the process. So I think the implications of when we're doing technique or process is an important one for us to consider in this. I could go on, but I think it might be time. I raised enough to give you what we might call at least an appetizer, you know, and to return now to the panel for further discussion.
Okay, thanks so much, Lynda. Yeah, let's turn it back to you, Jeffrey, and then we'll go over to Loch, and then we'll go over to the audience.
I loved what Lynda said, and I have just a few quick thoughts. Everyone, Sam with humor and his caring about his client and his kindness, and Loch teaching us about the unmanifest and this wakeful potential that we have moment to moment. All of that leads to what I was trying to talk about is spaciousness. And it struck me that there may be two aspects to spaciousness: spaciousness of awareness and spaciousness of the heart. And I thought that's what you were really both of you were really pointing to, a spaciousness of heart. And out of that comes a different level of compassion. So one place for me where therapy, I'm going to sort of go in a different direction than I did before. One place for me where spirituality is different than psychotherapy is that spirituality at its best offers the promise for expanded level of compassion than we have mapped, I think, in Western psychotherapy. So if you look at the best of Western psychotherapy and you look at people who've talked about care and concern like Eric Fromm, or empathy like Carl Rogers or Kohut, I think what in spiritual circles when we speak of compassion, it's different. It's hard to get at it, but one way to get at it is that often in therapy we're really talking about what I would call a local compassion. It's a compassion for my client, my family, my cohorts, my tribe, my ethnic group. And I think spiritual writings at their best are inviting us to see if something more is possible. This is illustrated in a wonderful Gandhi story. Many of you may know it. I apologize if you already know it. A man is hired to assassinate Gandhi. He's so moved by the power of Gandhi's spiritual teachings that he scraps his plan. He walks up to Gandhi after Gandhi finishes his talk, and he prostrates in front of Gandhi, and he says, "I'm so sorry I was hired to kill you." So imagine that happened to any one of us. Imagine any one of you were up here speaking, someone came up at the end and they said, "By the way, I was hired to assassinate you." What would we feel? What would we say? What would we do? Do you know what Gandhi's response was? "What are you going to tell your boss about your failed plan?" Right. Even in the face of a threat to his life, he kept his heart open and spacious enough where there was room for the other. That's what Lynda's talking about when she's inviting us to look at our reactions, look where we close down, look where we open up with given what all of us have said. So that's crucial for me, the spaciousness of awareness that Loch was talking of, and then I think it leads to a spaciousness of heart. The second thing I want to pick up on is Lynda's talking about technique process. I actually will, you captured my viewpoint well. I mean, I felt very understood in what you said, that in some way my project is presenting an integration that's so seamless that, you know, your neighbor who's not into any of this will not object. I think that one of the things we can do in the 21st century, people like Ken Wilber are trying to do this, we can find maps and bridges into wider and wider audiences, and we can touch more and more. But I think a trick in it is what they call upaya in Tibetan Buddhism, skillful means. And one aspect of skillful means is not trigger the resistance in the ears or the eyes of the listener. And one way that I think that helps with that is to avoid technical language that leaves people out. So when I speak, although I've been studying for over 30 years, meditation and yoga and defense mechanisms, I try to never use that language. I try to use language that you could explain to your 18-year-old neighbor. I think this stuff can be made very clear and very available. So I do, what's important to me is integrating this stuff in my being, not so much talking about spirituality and therapy. But I do sometimes introduce techniques. I work with a psychotic man. It was a Marion Milner-ish case, a kind of 10-year heroic odyssey he was on. We worked together for 10 years, 3 times a week, and so forth and so on. And he had a psychotic break in the middle of a session. And I saw that no work could really get done. So I taught him walking meditation, and we began to wordlessly walk together, feeling the soles of our feet, feeling the breeze on our face. So there are times when I actually bring in what you could call spiritual techniques, but it's really based on where the person is that I'm working with, and with a real clear sense, is this for me or for them? Last thing I'd like to say is something we haven't talked about yet today that I think is crucial. And that's that, frankly, I think we use the word spiritually in a profoundly vague and profligate way. And what happens is we use the word spiritual. I assume that you know what I mean. You assume that I know what you mean, and we don't. Several years ago, influenced by the philosopher Wittgenstein, who said the meaning of a word is its use in the language. You only know what someone means when you see how people use it. Not abstractly, but concretely. So I began to listen on a deeper level because I became aware of my own self-blindness, that I was assuming I knew what you meant when you said spiritual, you were assuming what I meant. And I started cataloging it, and I came up with 5 different meanings. And I'm just going to quickly say what they are. Because I think when we use the word spiritual, and Loch has now given me a 6, which I'm very grateful for. In the book I'm working on, The Art of Flourishing, I'm going to cite Loch on this. So there are at least 6, and I would be touched if you could come up with 23, because that's the idea. But here are the first 5. Spirituality is often used to express a sense of unity with something larger than yourself. It's what Freud meant by the oceanic experience. You're making love, you're jogging, you're emailing or writing a letter to a friend, and you feel this sense of overwhelming connection and communion with something larger. So that's one way the word spiritual is used. Another way it's used is to note qualities and virtues that are neglected in Western secular culture, like awe, wonder, tolerance, love, wisdom, and compassion. I call that the spirituality of character. Third way it's used is that a life is based on something higher than just my own self-aggrandizement. We see this with someone like Jimmy Carter after he went back to the South, after he was done with the presidency. His life became based on something even larger. We see it with Christopher Reeves, who may have had narcissistic tendencies, was an actor, and then later his life became based on something larger, helping other people. So that's a spirituality of meaning and purpose, where your life is based on a larger meaning and purpose than just your own. The fourth way I think it's used, which overlaps a little bit, is what I call the spiritual self. We see this with the Amish, with John Roberts, when he kills some of their children, and the family of the kids that were killed set up a fund for John Roberts and his family and invite him into their homes. That's this, you could call it the higher self, the spiritual self. And the fifth way I think it's used, so we have spirituality of unity, spirituality of character, spirituality of meaning and purpose, higher spiritual self, and the fifth way it's used is the path. And as you can start to hear, these are not all the same. So if you're walking later tonight, you tap into that sense of unity with something larger, you may not be developing qualities and virtues. You might not be on a path. And if you're on a path, you might not. So we have to, I think, start to get a map of what we mean by spirituality and be much more careful. So the fifth way is the path. The practices, the techniques, the prayer, meditation, yoga, etc., Tai Chi that fuel our spiritual journey. So that's what I want to add, that I think we need to be careful, we need to define our terms. I think it's all to the good to do that.
Jeffrey, how would you now include Loch's, what Loch said?
I think that's the sixth, and I think it's a quality of awareness, a quality of wakefulness that's available to all of us. And it strikes me as I'm thinking of your question, trying to embody what Locke's talking about. When you were talking about there's a seventh, at least, I mean there are 100, but there's a seventh, and that's having a sense that you have, you flow with the universe, you have equanimity about what's going on. I think that may even be a seventh. But I would have, Locke's would be spirituality of awareness or spirituality of the heart to me. A certain quality of wakefulness. It's not just it's wakefulness, and then it brings out a communion and an intimacy and a kindness, I think, with others. And then there's a deep connection. And out of that, you see, for me, I don't have to think technique. Years ago, I knew a guy who said to me, we were doing a program of integrative therapy. We were trying to do what Ken Wilber's now doing and what Michael Murphy was doing, integral practice. And this was in about 10 years ago. And he kept saying, we need to bring in spiritual techniques. And I said to him, Tony, if you could see what I see in the universe, you wouldn't need techniques because it flows organically. But one of the keys is what Locke is talking about and what Sam's talking about. If there's this kind-hearted connection, then it unfolds organically. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Loch, want to respond?
Yeah, so I'll do a short one because I want to hear from everyone. Just to say that dimension that you mentioned, yeah, because it's equally available in everyone, that it's almost a dimension of you know, in some ways the tradition I think I come from, my spiritual tradition is called the tradition of the human being. Because the beingness is in common, and this dimension, which has been found by those who in the past have practiced for 20, 30, 50 years, is now being both being able to be found and accessed very directly, because the kind of highest teachings are actually the simplest ways to just simply shift our awareness once we learn how to do that. Because it's not been accessible, it's not been taught, it's just not in our awareness. This awareness is almost like in the background or underneath or mixed in with everything. And when we look with thought, all we find is thoughts. And so we're kind of lost in this. As Einstein says, you can't solve the problem on the level it was created. You have to kind of get out of that level and find what has been called this awake heart, which has also been called the ultimate medicine. So this ultimate medicine seems to be the ground of being from which, and almost that which can know all the other dimensions and kind of do the work. That then kind of an integration starts, and in some ways I think therapists are uniquely positioned to be able to do that work with people, is when the awakeness is accessed and learns to know itself as this loving nature, then often the contents of consciousness, that which was defended against, begins to become more be invited back into consciousness, but now it's being dealt with this bigger, more vast, loving nature rather than a small, scared ego, which hasn't been able to include the early fear and terror, so that we had to become like the client, we had to become good, because we can't deal with the void or that feeling of shame, and that is not as big as beingness. That can be integrated, and that life force can be then included, and the whole thing is almost like reversed. So
thank you. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for setting this very broad stage for conversation.